afternoon, everybody. We have a really exciting session for you today, and thank you so much for joining us for the Climate Live K12 event for students, educators, and the public. This is a series at the Columbia Climate School, and I am Sarah Wagner. I'm a master's student in climate society at the Climate School and the graduate student assistant of K12 and continuing education, also here at the Climate School. I will be facilitating the session today, but I'm mostly looking forward to speaking with three of my classmates in the master's program for this session. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Climate School, or if you're joining us for the first time, we wanted to give a quick introduction. The Columbia Climate School was founded in July 2020. It's Columbia's university's first new school in 25 years, and it's dedicated to advancing transdisciplinary climate research. It's a hub for innovative climate solutions and brings together experts from fields to address the most pressing climate issues of our time. The Climate School is committed to shaping future leaders to drive climate solutions forward in every sector by offering educational programs for degree-seeking students, high school students, teachers, professional learners, and the public. By equipping changemakers with knowledge and skills, the Climate School empowers essential stakeholders in the fight for a just, prosperous society and a healthy planet. What we are hoping to do with these Climate Live K12 sessions is to introduce you all to our interdisciplinary work through our experts. So these monthly sessions will run throughout the academic year from November to June. This is the third session of our 2024-2025 series. And each session focuses on a certain topic and is dedicated to a certain age range. So this year, we also have a special series called Young Leaders in Action that focuses on the actions and successes of young people that are leading the way in climate action and driving change in their community. We've featured already 2 high schoolers working in climate action, and our April session features another young leader as well. Our other upcoming sessions include Architectures of Peace, linking sustainability, security, and stability, and Threading the Needle, tackling microplastic pollution from clothing, which is in March. So if you want any more information about the future sessions, you can visit our website, and past sessions are on the Climate School's YouTube page. But for now, I'm excited to introduce our 3 experts today. Their knowledge and interests span the breadth of the transdisciplinary academic work happening at the Climate School, and their expertise extends beyond the classroom. They'll be sharing with you today both as critical thinkers about global climate action, as well as practitioners working on the ground to advance the climate movement. On the next slide, we have our 3 presenters today, and we will have time for questions at the end, so please use that Q&A box as the chat is disabled. And lastly, this session is being recorded, and we'll send participants a link for the recording after it's complete. With that said, I'll turn it over to Kalain and Amy and Haley.
All right, I'll kick things off. So my name is Kalain. I'm a master's student here at Columbia. But first, I think I'll hand it over to Amy. Amy might be first in the lineup.
Thanks, Kalain, and thanks everyone for being here on a Wednesday afternoon. Yeah, if you hop to the next slide, I can kind of get right in. Yeah, so Amy, I'm in the Climate Society program, as Sarah mentioned, and I'm not from here. I'm from the UK, as you can tell from my accent. I studied geography at university, and then I joined UK government on their policy graduate scheme. I've always wanted to do international work. I grew up watching the news every single day with my parents. I've always been interested in other cultures and was just fascinated to work in other countries. So that was a key thread in my climate journey. I always knew that I wanted to work internationally. And then I had a geography lesson when I was 17, and it was about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the 2017 report. And I thought, wow, this is really bad. And I pivoted from studying English literature to geography. Yeah, and then from there, I knew that I wanted to kind of work in public policy. I wanted to do work that was kind of as impactful as possible. And the UK has a graduate scheme for that. I had several different postings. I worked on energy. In my first year, I worked in transport decarbonisation. I worked on visa crises, driver shortages, and then I was a youth delegate at COP27. Absolutely loved that conference. It's the UN's climate change conference that we'll be talking about. I knew that that's what I wanted to kind of work in, and then joined the COP team in the UK as a negotiator. and was doing that for about a year and a half. And now I'm here doing my master's because I wanted to pivot from working on mitigation to adaptation. If you hop to the next slide. So what is it like to be a negotiator? What is a negotiator? So you represent your country at international conferences, and you represent what your country wants to achieve. You defend your country's red lines, which is what politicians don't want to happen, and you work as closely as possible with your delegates from different countries to find a common outcome and find a consensus. So you're trying to coordinate as much as possible, you're trying to find an agreeable outcome, and everything is about understanding the other side, it's about empathy, it's about strategy. You give initial statements outlining your position, you then coordinate with different negotiating groups on what their country wants to achieve at the conference. You persuade different countries to add to your version of the text, and you work towards a final piece of text over the course of 2 weeks. And then that text, once finished, is gavelled through in front of all 197 countries that are signed up to this conference. And that's then published and considered kind of global climate policy that all these different countries try and implement in their own ways. And some of my golden moments were kind of witnessing countries that had entirely opposing political systems and ideologies, and they would still make compromises to reach a final agreement. One question I had, if anyone wants to answer, is what time do you think that I would wake up at the conference? It's a very, very unique kind of working environment. You can shout anything that you think would be helpful, or I can't remember. Was the chat disabled? If it is, that's totally fine.
Yeah, everyone's welcome to chime in the Q&A. My guess is
No worries.
4:30 a.m.
What was your guess?
4:30 a.m.
4:30 a.m. That's pretty much spot on. Yeah, it was 4:45 in the morning. So yeah, the point being that it's a very insane working environment that's very, very chaotic. It runs very late into the night and it always overruns. But yeah, and next slide just to finish things off. So yeah, why is the Paris Agreement important? So this is the global climate diplomacy text that all countries have signed up to, which is part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's the landmark of global climate diplomacy, and it's what everyone has been working towards since 2015. 2017, President Trump pulled out of it, Biden administration signed back onto it, and now we've pulled back out of the pact again. And that is the kind of best example of all 197 countries coming together and agreeing to stay within 1.5 degrees. Final slide, I think. Yeah, next slide. So yeah, and then I decided to pivot to climate adaptation and kind of come to Columbia because I felt that things were getting so bad that mitigation was not enough, and I wanted to work on adapting to the damages that we kind of already have. Columbia has a centre called the National Centre for Disaster Preparedness, and that's what the centre works to achieve on, is how do we adapt to the losses and damages that we can already see. Yeah, that's it from me. I will pass on to Kalain, who I think is next.
Oh yeah. All right. So again, my name is Kalain. I am from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. And I guess still a practicing journalist, a former broadcast meteorologist, and how I got there is not pretty the standard path. Pretty much the standard path. So I did my undergrad at Texas A&M, and I did it in geophysics, even though I really wanted to do meteorology instead, and I still ended up finding myself in that field. I really love science. I was not much of a writer back then. But while I was in Texas, Trinidad and Tobago was being hit by flood after flood, disaster after disaster. And back then I realized that there's a gap between an information gap between the authorities and the public, who was really much getting into social media back then. So while I was doing my undergrad, would have created a digital media company called Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center that focused on writing about weather and the hazards and the impacts that we experienced. And as time went on, sort of wrote a bit more about weather, climate, and the environment. And then it started in 2014, really got on the map back home in 2017 after that hurricane season caused so much devastation in the Caribbean. And in Trinidad and Tobago, it was one of our wetter years on record with basically daily impactful floods. Next slide. Um, and then I left Texas A&M and returned to Trinidad and Tobago. And I mean, you guys who are in high school right now trying to decide where you're going to go to college, but after college, you need to figure out, okay, what are you going to do with your life? So I came back to Trinidad and Tobago, didn't have a job lined up. Geophysics would have put me into the oil and gas industry, and I did some internships in that, realized that is not what I wanted to do. But thankfully, my work with Trinidad and Tobago Weather Center put me on the map, and the largest media company in Trinidad and Tobago at that time was looking for a broadcast meteorologist. And they cold called me, offered me the job. And after telling them no, initially I took it. And that began sort of the rest, the rest is history at that point. Started being the weather anchor and environmental reporter back in 2019. Um, and really was covering the impacts of a changing climate without actually knowing what I was covering, right? So floods, rough seas, coastal flooding, coastal erosion, hot temperatures, all that stuff. But after covering it for so long, I was just like, okay, what is actually causing it to be that bad? So in the middle of 2022, that's when I really got into the climate space and started looking at climate change impacts. And I would have covered the COP that Amy spoke about in Glasgow virtually, just sort of what actually happens at these events. So when it was time now to go to COP27, I was just like, I'm going to try and get to go there as a journalist. And thankfully, I would have found a fully funded environmental fellowship through the Earth Journalism Network. And they funded me to go to COP27 as a reporter. And it changed the trajectory of my career, honestly, being there, getting to rub shoulders with world leaders, the exposure with the cream of the crop in climate science and climate change, and the policymakers who are really making a difference when it comes to negotiating a greener future and a future that hopefully we'll be able to survive in. Um, and then that really kicked off my environmental reporting there. I was still, broadcast meteorologist, still doing the weather on TV every night, but also doing climate change reporting. And as a result of my reporting from 2022 into 2023, that actually earned me Trinidad and Tobago's highest environmental honor called the Green Leaf Award. So it really put me on the map and changed my trajectory of my career. Next slide, please. And then 2023 as well, in the Caribbean, like in the US, there's a Pulitzer Prize. In the Caribbean, there's a Caribbean Broadcasting Union Awards. And 5 of my stories actually ended up winning those awards. And the trajectory that I was on then put me at COP28 with another environmental fellowship where I also produced stories and reported from COP in that point would have been Dubai. And at these really large conferences, there's not a lot of people from the Caribbean. So being able to have a Caribbean perspective on it, highlight the voices that are there, super duper important for reporting back home because a lot of the people in the Caribbean, they face hurricanes, they face coastal erosion, but they don't necessarily know that this is as a result of climate change, a warming world, and all of the other factors that play into that. So my role as a journalist and really a science communicator was breaking down what was happening at those conferences, what's happening around the world when it comes to our climate, and how that is really impacting us in Trinidad and Tobago. And just jumping through 2024 real quickly, I was selected as Earth Journalism Network, one of their year-long fellows, which actually wraps up at the end of this month to cover climate change stories in the Caribbean. And I also won 2 more awards for CBU in 2024. And after that award ceremony, I ended up here at Columbia, where I'm studying climate and society with a focus on disaster risk reduction. Also doing a little bit of a pivot out of broadcast journalism. And I'm still like, once you get bitten by the journalism bug, it's very hard to leave the field, but moving more so into working with organizations to reduce disaster risk, their disaster risk and countries' disaster risk going forward. So with that, I will leave it there and hand it over to Haley.
Hi, everyone. I am Haley Crim. This is my timeline. I stole Kalain's idea. of just how I ended up at COP. So you've heard from the negotiator side, which is, countries representing and how they interact, the journalism side covering what's going on, especially in the negotiation rooms. And then I attended as an observer, which is basically everyone else. So we'll talk about that a little bit in a second. But how did I actually end up at these conferences? So I started, and I was there in the context of environmental justice and advocacy, and that's what a lot of observers are there to do. Not all though, but that my journey really started when I was in high school. I graduated in 2015. I went to a Quaker school, so it was very, steeped from a young age in activism and advocacy and civics and things like that. But didn't really get involved in it until I was in college. I went to school in Maine and studied environmental studies, surprise, and got also really involved in political activism around climate change and civil rights and things like that in Maine. After I graduated, I joined AmeriCorps and did a year of service in a local government in the south side of Chicago, focusing specifically on environmental justice and putting that into practice in an actual government context, which, as you might expect, is very hard, but very rewarding. And it was an incredible experience that informed my interest in negotiation and policy in general. After AmeriCorps, I went from like the super local, it was like 21,000 people in the town that I worked in, to the completely international, and I attended COP26 in Scotland as the coordinator of the Action for Climate Empowerment delegation from the US. That basically encompasses climate education, workforce development, training, communication, access to information, all of that good stuff that's like the cultural shifting part of climate change. So there were 80 of us there, and I was, making sure everyone was at the places they were supposed to speak on time and things like that, and setting up meetings and stuff like that. I also attended COP27 in Egypt as a person working on the climate justice pavilion. I'll talk about pavilions in a second, but basically trying to raise the profile of climate justice and people who have been impacted by climate justice concerns and who are there to speak about climate justice in negotiations and in the COP process in general. And then COPs 28 and 29, I was able to work on the US pavilion, specifically on events around like youth engagement, climate justice, and workforce development. So continuing that action for climate empowerment thing through all of those 4 COPs that I've been involved with. Those I wasn't actually physically at, but was working on it virtually. So if you can go to the next slide, just a real quick, COP actually happens in 2 parts. The negotiating side happens exclusively in the blue zone, which is super high security. You need a badge there. You have to get accredited by the UN. And that's where, the celebrities and the presidents and everything tend to be in the blue zone. The green zone is open to everyone. It varies dramatically based on where the country, who's hosting is, and you don't have to have a badge for that. And it's more culture and business focused, and you can have more like a trade show a little bit, although there's definitely a trade show aspect to the blue zone. So if you can go to the next slide, I mentioned pavilions. This is the aspect of the COP process where most observers find themselves. So there are 2 ways, major ways, there's other ways, that observers can participate in the COP process. So you can attend and speak in negotiations and plenaries. This is a picture of my friend, who's also at the climate school actually as a postdoc, Isati Cintron Rodriguez, speaking about climate justice at the COP26. So there are ways that you can be given time to speak as an observer if you're representing a delegation, maybe of, women or farmers or youth. There are these existing bodies that people get to speak every time, but you can't vote on things or, change specific text. You just say, as on behalf of the women of the world, this is what we're thinking or something like that. You also host pavilions. So this is a picture of the Food and Climate Pavilion at COP27, which is basically a small room that you can build. They can be beautiful, where each, country or organization or, interest group can host their own talks and content to bring attention to whatever that they want to talk about. So that when I worked on the Climate Justice Pavilion, I was like physically in this little pavilion, coordinating events around climate justice. And it also serves as like a home base for all the people who then go out to the negotiations and talk to the government officials about their issues so people can coordinate. If you can go to the next slide. speaking of government officials, COP is also a great place to meet with people that you might not otherwise be able to meet with. So that's a huge part of what observers do while we're there. So you meet with government negotiators or representatives from your government. That's a picture of John Kerry meeting with youth from the US. You also can lobby elected officials and government representatives who are there. So that's people from the climate justice delegation meeting with Ed Markey, who's a senator. So you can really work on both affecting the COP process and what's going on, as well as climate politics in your own country while you're there. So that's a huge, huge piece of what observers do. And then lastly, if you can go to the last slide, there's some more like fun or creative things, like for example, protesting and drawing attention to key issues is essential to make sure that the negotiators and the media and the people of the world understand what the key issues are. For example, this is around loss and damage and debt. Was a protest at COP27. And then there's also, it's, as Amy said, it's super stressful and intense and kind of depressing sometimes. So a lot of observers, especially in recent years, have been leaning more into art and music and networking and like fun events to make it just a better time, basically, and to let people, decompress and interact in a different way, take the tension down a little bit, because we're all there for the same reason, fundamentally. So yeah, that's a little bit about what observers do and my background, and I think now we'll take questions.
Thank you all so much for your introductions and all your thoughts, and for getting us thinking about just the many ways that you all have engaged in climate action, the many ways people from around the world engage in these processes. For most of us who are not able to actually be there and we just read about sort of the outcomes in the news, it's really exciting to hear about your personal experiences. And I will start by asking you a bit more about that, but I just want to remind everybody that we do have the Q&A. We want to touch on the things that you want to hear about. So if you have any questions now that you've heard about our panelists' perspective, please do put it there and we'll be sure to address it. But in the meantime, I would love to hear from you all if there are any inspiring speakers or light bulb moments or memorable conversations that stick out for you as you think about the COP that you have attended. I'll start with you, Amy, if you have one in mind.
There's a lot to choose from. I think one of the golden moments was probably seeing Mia Mottley, who's the Prime Minister of Barbados, speaking very powerfully, cogently, carefully at the plenary at COP28 about her disappointment in the lack of progress on debt, and her whole piece is that there needs to be reform to how debt works and operates in developing countries, and that's a big blocker to climate progress. And she's such a powerful speaker and orator, and she just leaves such an incredible energy behind whenever she speaks. So yeah, that's one golden moment.
Thank you for sharing, and it brings together what I was going to ask about next, which were, light bulb moments and memorable things, but also some notable challenges or disappointments you all have thought about. So if they get knit together as well, I would love to hear about that from either of the other two of you.
Yeah, I have kind of a similar story. I remember being in a plenary at COP26, and there was a 9-year-old girl from Namibia who was invited to speak and gave just the most moving and incredible, articulate, beautiful speech. And everyone stood up and was clapping and crying, and it was amazing. And then at the same time, to know that these people were going to turn around and go back into the negotiation room and fight to make progress harder. Not everyone, obviously, but some people can hear those kind of stories, and they can hear from, the world's leading climate scientists and things in plenaries or just in the hallway, and then go back and, still fight to weaken language or, against justice aspects and things like that. So it's a double-sided coin.
Yeah, I think my memorable moment, I mean, I can't really follow that 9-year-old girl that was speaking because I think I was at that COP as well, was I would have moderated a panel at COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. So this would have been COP 27. And it was when Vanuatu, which is a very small Pacific island nation, was now coalescing support to get an advisory opinion sent to the UN General Assembly at that point in time to go to the ICJ, which the International Court of Justice. And basically what they were trying to do at that panel was talk about the impacts that they face as small islands in the Pacific, which face sea level rise. They had also a little girl, but she wasn't 9. I think she was like 14 or something. Speak about her journey to get to school, what it was like before and what it was like now, how she has to scale cliffs, basically because the path that she used to take is now underwater. You heard from that panel as well, from the legislators and policymakers on what they were trying to do, because what they were trying to do is basically find another avenue to hold wealthier, more polluting nations accountable for the pollution that they produced and small islands now disproportionately face. And just being part of that moment, and now, I think it was a last month or the month prior, where it finally made it to the ICJ, and I think 100 and something countries signed on to it, and you heard the arguments of the ICJ. It was a very full circle moment for me, but being part of the incipient process was pretty neat too.
Yeah, I can see in all of your responses that sort of like the push-pull of how moving it is that people are speaking and fighting and doing all the things, and that they have this venue to be heard, and then to see them not heard in the way that we might hope. Just, I can hear that in all of your stories. We have a question from a participant who says, "This was very insightful. At COP, disagreement is inevitable. So what is one way to market climate policy that is opposite to capitalistic views many countries adhere to?" Thank you so much for your question. That's cutting right to, I'm sure, difficult aspect of these negotiations.
Yeah, that is the question, maybe. And I'll be interested to hear also what you guys think from different perspectives. From the more advocate perspective, what works best is honestly to find ways that what you want connects to what they want. So it's not necessarily getting around views, but if you can, for example, market something that might be more expensive but would reduce healthcare costs in the long term, or would protect the labor force, or improve, air quality or something like that. If you're able to find whatever negotiator, government, corporation, whatever cares about, and make it your argument in that language, that can be way more effective than shaming them, or just saying this is what we have to do or something like that. Like, you have to find that common ground.
Yeah, I think I want to follow on that, because a lot of small islands, basically what they do is it's an existential threat to small island states. There's very little that they can do outside of pleading with wealthier nations. So it does come across as naming and shaming, but really and truly, there's very little that they can do I mean, now they're stepping into adaptation, but you can only adapt so much out of a boiling pot that is rising, right? So yeah, I'm interested to hear from a negotiation standpoint, Amy, what you have to say on this.
Yeah, I love both of your answers. I completely agree. And the way that I sort of have tempered my frustration and sadness and disappointment coming back from, so many late nights, is diplomacy and negotiations are necessarily about compromise. And in diplomacy training, everything that we do is about finding a middle ground. And what that obviously means is that you have such a spectrum of political systems, cultures, policies, wants, and needs. And you have to walk into a negotiation knowing that you are not going to get exactly what you want, knowing that you're going to probably have to make late night calls to your officials, asking to clear a red line, asking for an exception. And that is global climate policy. If you're going to have a global multilateral system, that must contain compromise. And I do always think back to stories from my bosses and officials about the Paris Agreement, and the fact that was a huge landmark moment in years and years of diplomacy that led to that document getting through. And it was a big deal, and it continues to be a big deal. So yeah, I think necessarily pitching it as a compromise, and of which that compromise is helpful in the overall progress towards getting where we need to go.
Thanks. Thanks all. Yeah, it is useful to see it sort of in that trajectory. I wonder if that sort of makes it feel like there is progress happening, and thinking about those people that you admire and sort of the work that they had to do to get to that point. We are getting to the end of our time, but we do have one more participant question that I'm going to toss over to you all. This participant says, very cool experiences. You all are so articulate. Did you see traction on the fossil fuels non-proliferation treaty at recent COPs?
I can jump in for this one. So I was also fortunate enough to moderate a panel for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty in Dubai. And at that panel is actually where Colombia signed on to it, which Colombia is a massive petrostate as well, right? So that was a really big deal. I don't remember what the latest number is on how many countries have signed on, but at that point it was only 9. So with Colombia signing on is a very big deal, and also signaling to other countries that, even though oil and gas is at the basis of our economy, we can change. And I think that ambition continued into Climate Week here. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty had a number of events in New York City last year for Climate Week, and I think a number of other countries have signed on then.
All right, with that, thanks, Kalain. We will wrap up because we're over time. Thank you all so much for your wisdom and authenticity and for sharing your time with us. And thank you to everyone who attended. We will see you at another Climate Live.